We now move to session 2, the search for digital sovereignty, implications for supply chain security and critical infrastructure protection. And to moderate this session, I would like to introduce Christopher Mondini, Vice President, Stakeholder Engagement Europe, Managing Director, Brussels Office, ICANN. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be here and always a pleasure to participate in an IIC event, and the opening panel and speaker set us off on a really good track for a discussion today. I'm Chris Mondini. As Lynn said, I sit in Brussels, leading the European region for ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And today, what I'll do in terms of the session moderation is I'll briefly introduce the topic. I'll list our 3 panelists with a brief introduction, though I've invited them to say more about themselves and their organizations in their remarks. And then each in turn will give a few minutes of opening statements, remarks, and their take on this particular topic. And after that, I have some questions to pose to them, some that we've discussed in advance, but some that they haven't seen yet, to keep them on their toes. But I do want to encourage all of you who are here today to think of your questions on the topic of digital sovereignty. As we continue with the discussion, you can enter them in the chat, and it's always nice when we have a lively debate to finish off a panel. So again, thanks for this opportunity to moderate. I think the title of the session is very apt. It's called The Search for Digital Sovereignty. And I think the word search really explains a key aspect that I've been considering, which is how do we really define digital sovereignty? In my desktop research and conversations, I find that it's a different interpretation, really depending on where you come from, what, say, stakeholder group you belong to, if you're sitting in government or technical community or business, and also what the motivations are. And the way we respond to efforts to assert digital sovereignty also depend where we come from. Are you a regulator? Are you a business? Are you a consumer group? And what are your concerns? And what are your hopes and aspirations for this move for sovereignty, which we see in many geographies? As ICANN, which is the neutral coordinating body for the Internet's addressing systems, I am always delighted to be in the role of moderator at an event such as this, because in terms of actions and proposals on things like digital sovereignty, when they take the form of government regulation or legislation that's proposed, we are completely neutral. We don't tell IGOs or governments what to do, but we do explain technically how there may be an effect on the workings of the Internet, which of course is the global platform upon which all of our digital services, digital environment are built. So while I don't opine on particular initiatives, I do like to keep everybody reminded that as much as we want to build digital sovereignty, digital self-determination, digital autonomy, which tends to be associated with a geography, that it still is built upon a global neutral platform, and to be assured to please be aware of how it might affect interoperability, global availability, the expansion of the Internet, the effects on end users and on all of us who depend on it. So again, that was my note about ICANN's role. Coming back to the topic, though, I think it is important to think about the broader trends that are the impetus for this debate. We are clearly living through a time of insecurity and instability. We see that through the years of pandemic that we've been passing. We've learned that we're very, very dependent on the digital services that keep our businesses, economies, lives, administrative services, and so forth running. We have what I call centrifugal forces. There's in geopolitics. I was a staunch defender of globalization and global integration, and I feel the tides have turned to the extent that we have outright conflict, to say nothing of trade disputes, divergence over standards approaches, and so forth. So coupled with that period of insecurity, I see there are increased demands from all parties for a more robust set of digital services, the economy, the jobs that depend upon them, the innovation that we need to enable to provide prosperity for citizens and users in the future. So these are sort of the big trends in which these proposals and debates are taking place. And in true IIC fashion, we have a really excellent panel that combines business and regulatory perspectives. And as I said, I'll ask each of the three panelists to speak in turn to give an opening set of remarks. Please allow me to introduce them to you. We will begin with Matt Allison. Matt Allison is Senior Public Policy Manager for Vodafone Group. He has a very interesting background in technology policy in both the consultancy sector, but also in the NGO civil society sector. And so I'd be interested in his perspectives there. And of note, he has a background in Eastern European Russian, Slavic, Slavonic studies. Perhaps, in fact, he'll be able to comment on some of the relationship between our topic and the current crisis in that part of Europe. After Matt, we will hear from Elena Grimes. Elena is with Microsoft. She is the General Manager for Cyber Affairs and Critical Infrastructure, and has joined us in Brussels, having had a number of very interesting roles in Microsoft at their Washington State headquarters in the United States. And given her role and given all of the proposals and initiatives of the EU and in Brussels, I think she's arrived at exactly the perfect time. She has a diverse background with expertise in intellectual property law, and even was lucky enough to work on some ICANN generic top-level domain work in her past career. So she's lucky enough to have spent some time on ICANN issues, and we're grateful for that. And then finally, Bernardo Herman. He is on the executive board of the Belgian Institute for Postal Services and Telecommunications. And again, as I mentioned, with a regulatory background, but interestingly bridges the telecoms, but also the media content aspects of regulation. So a very diverse group with great backgrounds that should be able to bring in lots of perspectives. I will ask Matt then to kick us off with your opening remarks, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you for referencing the academic background, which doesn't get called out too much these days. But when we were studying that particular region 10 years ago, it seemed very relevant then. It seems much more relevant now, of course. And maybe to link that then in just a few introductory remarks, so we've been asked to reflect on the theme of digital sovereignty, which is a very live, a very interesting discussion. At Vodafone, we've been looking into this issue really for the best part of a year, quite intensively now. And maybe before going into the research we've done, just to introduce myself and my role within the company very briefly. Vodafone's probably known to everyone on the panel and the audience, but just in case anyone's missed us, we're a global technology and telecommunications service provider. We're active across 10 EU member states and of course globally, with heavy concentration in sub-Saharan Africa. So the theme of digital sovereignty touches us very, very closely, and it has a very big impact on the way that we structure and we run our business. So as I say, we've been grappling with the issue for the best part of a year in detail, and of course it's been given added urgency and added prominence in the past month, given that we actually have an acute issue of territorial sovereignty, an actual state's territorial sovereignty being compromised on the very borders of Europe. Now, this is not in any way the kind of the premise or the frame of reference for our report, which looks much more at sovereignty in the context of supply of digital, in particular cloud services. But of course, it gives the debate, I think, added prominence. It throws into sharp relief some of the issues that, in particular, EU policymakers have been grappling with in trying to assert the region's strategic autonomy, ability to control its own destiny in what, as you say, is an increasingly uncertain, risky, potentially dangerous geopolitical environment. And of course, this then feeds into sort of the parallel approach of EU policymakers, which is to establish a coherent industrial strategy. And this spans a number of different domains, which aren't, of course, all related to digital or kind of internet-based issues. But of course, digital sovereignty has been identified as a key strategic technology domain where the EU and EU policymakers want to establish this sovereignty, this ability to be masters of their own destiny. And at Vodafone, that's something that we're very supportive of, and we want to play a role in enabling. So just to kind of recap on our interest, obviously we're a service provider of connectivity services, but we're increasingly looking at new opportunities in areas like cloud solutions, and in particular edge solutions, where we're enabling super low latency and high capacity data processing at the edge of the network, which is really important for future applications like, if we look at automotive sectors, we look at smart manufacturing, we look at the future of healthcare, where you need to ensure that you have this low latency data processing. And this is something which Vodafone wants to be a key enabler of. And really, we think this is going to underpin the digital and the green transitions that the European Commission has set out. So with that background, we've partnered with Capgemini to produce some original research in the field of cloud, edge, and data sovereignty. We've been working on this, as I say, for the past 8 months, and we now released the findings, so they're accessible on our website. I'll be happy to share a link afterwards to the report. And perhaps what I can do very briefly now is just to recap and run through some of the main findings and the key policy recommendations that we've arrived at, and then happy to elaborate on any of that in the Q&A. Maybe just to give a wrap around, the overall message that we're looking to convey with this report is that in establishing digital sovereignty, we really encourage European policymakers to embrace the value of partnering with like-minded countries that share EU values and are able to demonstrate essential equivalence with EU laws, and to leverage regulation to ensure contestable and fair markets that deliver for EU citizens. That's kind of the underlying message of our report. Just to go quickly through some of the key findings that will probably be useful to stimulate the discussion. We've surveyed different national approaches to cloud and in particular edge deployment. And what we found is that there is an increasing degree of fragmentation, which we think has the potential to create a real risk to the integrity of the single market. So we're seeing national policy frameworks for cloud services. We've looked in detail at the report, France, Spain, Germany, and Italy. We see some discrepancies that we think are a little bit concerning, and also some requirements in these national frameworks, in particular the requirement to guarantee immunity to third country law, which we think are potentially impractical and could be in conflict with fundamental principles of both EU and international law. So, we're highlighting that as an issue for the Commission to consider and presenting much more of a basis for intervention than perhaps existed even five or so years ago. We've also surveyed customers and asked them what they think is important when it comes to sovereignty. And the two things which stick out most strongly in the feedback from cloud customers is security, control over data, and ability to maximize the value of their own data, which really means being able to share it with third parties, to collaborate with third parties, and port both data and applications across cloud environments. Something which the current regulatory framework does not necessarily allow them to do, in the quantities they would like to do. We uncovered an interesting finding that 66% of those surveyed said that a total ban on non-EU providers would impact on their financial projections over the next couple of years. There is an important economic element to consider there. And then we also conducted some economic modelling and we describe 3 distinct scenarios on a spectrum going from most closed, an approach that we call Fortress Europe, through to most kind of open and market-led, which we call the sort of the more laissez-faire approach. And then, of course, we land somewhere in the middle, as is often the way, borrowing on some of the aspects of both, the benefits of both approaches, in what we call open strategic sovereignty, which is not a new term. I understand it's in the discussion already, but we've really tried to put some meat on the bones, describe what would go into that in terms of a policy and regulatory framework, and what would be the outcome of that open strategic sovereignty approach. And what we've demonstrated is a net benefit of 15.5% additional percentage points of cloud adoption over the baseline scenario. And that translates to a 576 billion euro value add for the European economy. So there's some real kind of economic kind of benefit coming out of this open strategic sovereignty approach that we want to put forward to policymakers. So those are the findings. Maybe just very briefly before handing back to summarize the recommendations that come out of this. The first, unsurprisingly, is that we're asking policymakers to align on a harmonized definition of sovereignty in the context of cloud and edge services, which would guard against the fragmentation at the national layer that we're seeing. We're calling for fit-for-purpose regulatory oversight of cloud services, recognizing that in effect today the market is somewhat under-regulated and not delivering really in the interests of consumers, particularly when it comes to that point around switching and portability between service providers. And you know, this is something that the EU Commission is very alive to and has actually addressed in its proposal for an EU Data Act very recently, but we see more coming down the track in the form of the EU Cloud Rulebook later in the year. The point that we're making is that those initiatives are great, but they need to be backed up with a regulatory framework that is harmonized at the European level. It doesn't exist really today in the context of cloud services. So we have some recommendations and some lessons that we think we can draw from the telecom sector in this particular field. And then lastly, to kind of reiterate the point around adopting a strategically open approach and to regulate rather than exclude service providers to deliver in the interest of EU citizens and customers. So I'll stop there, because hopefully that's a good overview of the findings. As I say, I can share the link online here, but happy to respond to any questions that you may have based on that. I think it should be a slow burn and lots of discussions to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that. And we look forward to seeing the link. It's good timing that you've come out with a report on this. And I think you've really taken cloud and edge computing as like a case study. And the open strategic sovereignty, I think, is very clearly a middle way. I was surprised by your points that there's still national regulations that is hindering actual sort of interoperability and economic success. And I was really interested to hear that you went out and surveyed the customers, and that they're not only just concerned about control and security, but they really want to have a progressive realizing the value of data. And this requires, I think, the flexible open approach that you're proposing, and it is very timely given the EU initiatives. So we will come back to you on many questions there, but thanks for really framing it in terms of Vodafone's offerings, and I think very helpful advice in the report. I will now ask Elena Grimes of Microsoft to take the floor and explain her take, Microsoft's take, and interests of topics of interest to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And thank you for the kind introduction, Chris. As you mentioned, I'm Elena Grimes. I'm a general manager for our cyber affairs and critical infrastructure team here at the Microsoft European Government Affairs. I joined the team here in Brussels about 5 months ago now, and I have indeed spent the last 10 years at our headquarters in Redmond or in Washington State in the US, with a variety of roles, from IP-specific roles to supporting our global consumer sales business divisions. I've been at Microsoft for 14 plus years. I'm Italian by background, so I've worked both in Italy as well in the other European countries and the US. And perhaps the diverse nature of my background is a good preamble to explain a bit how diversified our Microsoft business is, The company has been traditionally known for its Windows operating system and the Office suite of software applications like Word, Excel, PowerPoint. But far are those days where those products like packaged software and some hardware were, the essence of our business. Today, Microsoft is fundamentally a company focused on what we call the intelligent cloud and the intelligent edge. To Matt's point also on the relevance and importance of edge and edge computing. And our products and services range from commercial cloud offerings to communication services, social media platforms, if you think like LinkedIn, to our consumer products like Xbox gaming consoles and our Surface devices. So in the land of regulation of the digital industry, I think we more or less live it all. But to tackle today's discussion, I wanted to perhaps build a bit upon what Chris mentioned in his introduction and spend a few minutes to contextualize the environment we operate in today, which is also the basis for the study that Vodafone and Capgemini just released, as you heard from my fellow panelist, Matt. So today, computing has fundamentally become more and more embedded in every place and everything we do, as individuals, as businesses, as societies. This era of what we call digital transformation has seen an incredible acceleration due to the past 2 years of the COVID pandemic, and we believe is characterized by 5 trends that will drive the next generation of innovation. The first is ubiquitous and centralized computing. So organizations, small, large, in every industry, in every country, will require more ubiquitous and more decentralized compute power. And this will drive and is driving radical changes in computing architecture, from materials, semiconductors to systems, across both the cloud and the edge. So we believe this will result in growing demand and need for more decentralized control as well as sovereignty, which takes us to the topic of today. The second trend is that the volume, the variety, and velocity of data will go through explosive growth in the cloud, and in particular, again, to Matt's point, at the edge. And this decentralization of data will equally require it to be more private and more sovereign, however that is defined. Third, our economy will need to balance between consumption and creation. If you think about the past decades, we've really seen several tech advances that drove consumption, more browsing, more shopping, more binge watching. But behind all of this consumption is creation, and we really believe that the next decade will require technology to advance and radically democratize creation. Fourth, we will need, all of us, everyone, governments, industry, will need to invest more in capacity building and skilling to empower the global workforce. We need to create a more continuous loop of feedback between work, skills, learning, and credentials that are required not just for today, but especially for the future jobs, the jobs of tomorrow. And fifth is what we summarize as trust by design. Our technology needs to be secure by design. We need to design and build the technology with the intent to protect the fundamental rights of all people, including privacy and security, and to strengthen the institutions that we all depend on for our livelihoods. So within this context, I think we can see that Europe's aspirations for digital sovereignty are fundamentally driven by valid concerns around security, privacy, economic opportunity, and mutual dependencies. And these have only been reinforced by the COVID-19 pandemic and, of course, the tragic past month of war in the Ukraine. We, as Microsoft, understand Europe's valid concerns in this space, and we firmly believe that as industry, we need to engage constructively in supporting the EU's ambitions with its digital regulatory agenda. But to address these concerns, we do need to take a balanced approach to ensure that this search for sovereignty does not happen at the expense of economic opportunity, innovation, and for what is closer to my world and my remit, cybersecurity. As Matt pointed out in the overview of the study that they just released, it is important that the EU, we adopt a regulatory approach that balances adequately between the legitimate sovereignty interests and the Union's longer-term competitiveness and innovation. So if you don't mind, I'll just focus another minute on the cybersecurity space, because the question of security obviously is particularly important today in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine, which is top of mind for us all. I do believe that the EU has been demonstrating very strong leadership in seeking strong, harmonized regulatory framework in the area of cybersecurity. We see this reflected in the revised EU cybersecurity strategy and in the legislative initiatives like the Network Information Security or NIS2 directive, the development of an EU-wide cybersecurity certification schemes like the EUCS for cloud services, and the upcoming Cyber Resilience Act, as well as the EIDAS regulation around to create a framework of digital identity at an EU level. All these regulatory efforts will advance and strengthen the EU's cybersecurity resilience and capacity across critical infrastructure, supply chains and beyond. But as Matt was pointing out, in a quest to ensure this sovereignty, some of the policy schemes and provisions being considered risk having the adverse effect of fragmentation, of legal uncertainty, as well as diminishing the region's overall cybersecurity resilience and capabilities. So if you take the cybersecurity certification specifically, we are seeing the emergence of diverging sets of national certification schemes for cloud service providers to provide cloud services to entities in the public sector or critical infrastructure. And some of those are emphasizing requirements that relate to immunity from non-EU law, to limitations on how cloud service providers are owned or controlled by non-EU entities, including proposals that perhaps cloud service providers offering services to public sector should be headquartered in the EU in order to be certified to do so. This means that under the banner of digital sovereignty, we are seeing a potential increase in fragmentation of the cloud and the edge environments across the EU member states. And we believe this actually would have the opposite effect because it would increase the cyber vulnerabilities. At Microsoft, one of our principal global responsibilities as a company is to help defend governments, countries, and citizens from cyber attacks. We currently, through our global network, are analyzing over 24 trillion security signals every 24 hours. We have almost 10,000 experts spread across the globe to do so. And through these global operations, we're able to identify, to assess, and to contain cyber threats. But in a fragmented and less harmonized cloud environment, this ability to identify, analyze, and contain cyber attacks can definitely become more challenging. And so I'll stop there. I do think that one of the key messages is, leaving aside cybersecurity is we really need to look at the EU not to solve sovereignty for the EU market, but to look at the EU from its competitiveness in the global market, and to ensure that however we search and we find digital sovereignty in the EU, it enables its industries and leading industries in continuing to be competitive by accessing the best technologies and innovations and being able to lead at a global scale and not just within the EU. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. That's a number of very interesting points that you raised. And, it occurs to me one person's sovereignty is another person's fragmentation. I mean, these are the risks that we're coping with here. But I also heard a note of optimism because you used the word balance, and I think a confidence that a balance can be struck if it does focus on enablement of innovation. And I was very interested to see this dichotomy between the consumption side and the creation side. I think that's a great way to frame some of these discussions as well. And you started out talking about ubiquitous computing power. And so again, ubiquitous means it's available everywhere. And to me, sovereignty is still trying to have some sort of regional or national paradigm. And so this is, I think, the inherent tension that we're exploring in some of these discussions. So thank you for formulating those ideas. I think it's, and finally, I want to say thank you to Microsoft. You are such a good global citizen when it comes to everything you're doing in cybersecurity, identifying threats, monitoring. So many of us and our stakeholders rely on all the work that you do. So thanks for those remarks. Bernardo, I would love for you to weigh in as from the regulatory standpoint, for you to tell us some of your reactions to the comments to date, but of course your own personal take on the issue of digital sovereignty and what work you've been doing that relates to the topic.
Many thanks, Chris. Many thanks for inviting a regulator on this panel. As you know, I've been working both in the private sector and the public sector. Now I am on the side of regulators. One of the departments for which I have responsibilities is the Network Security Department. So logically, my missions are mainly aiming at reducing the risk exposure of telecom networks. In these difficult times of international crisis, we have multiple challenges, as you can imagine. For instance, we are identifying critical infrastructures. We are accompanying the telecom operators in protecting their assets. And together with them, we are actually managing cyber attacks on a weekly basis. As regards the concept of digital sovereignty, it is clear that there is no specific and stabilized definition, which is a situation, of course, which allows a lot of interpretation. In my view, this concept can be connected to the one of strategic autonomy that Charles Michel, a Belgian guy, I like to refer to this big Belgian guy. So Charles Michel emphasized this in a speech last year. He said that strategic autonomy means more resilience, more influence, and less independence. This means reducing our dependencies to better defend our interests and values. We want to greater autonomy and greater independence. He referred also to the need to do that in an open and global environment. The goal then is to reduce our dependencies, and this is actually what we aim to do very concretely, very practically in our policy approach and the way we implement them. So as it has been said, cloud-related issues are tremendously interesting, and at the same time, the concept of sovereignty, digital sovereignty, goes well beyond these issues, in my view. It touches 5G networks, how we protect them, the way we work together in case of cyber attacks, the way we develop collaboration platforms with other member states. And one of the key points that I would like to make now is actually the following one. The fact that despite that the concept of sovereignty gives the idea that there is a growing national concern, we should not stop collaborating with other European member states because, of course, the concerns are multinational. And if we are left alone, we would not be able to face all these challenges. So exchanging good practices, in my view, is crucial. So let's keep collaborating, let's keep cooperating, and the regulator can be seen as a friend, actually, someone who wants to do you good rather than a police officer eager to sanction. That was my message now.
Thank you for that. And I think that's an invitation to be collaborative, and also one that touches on the issue that both Elena and Matt mentioned, which is the surprising amount of, even within the EU, national approaches. So I've always long admired the European Union for being very good at building consensus. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm always reminding that consensus among 27 member states is one thing, but the internet is global, and we have about 190 member states of internet users around the world. But Europe certainly is setting the agenda. I hear loud and clear your desire for the regulator to be seen as a friend and a partner in building the kind of balanced, strategic, regional sovereignty that we've been talking about so far. And finally, I am glad that you mentioned Charles Michel, because this is another aspect that I find encouraging, even though we may have a lot of advice for the EU. One thing that always strikes me is that policy proposals tend to start from a position of the citizen, the user, the dignity, the autonomy, as you say. And this is, I think, a very positive way to make proposals. Which actually, I think, leads me to my first question to the panel. I know I haven't insisted on a definition of digital sovereignty, but I heard different interpretations and wished for interpretations. So I don't know if it can be summed up in one word, but I'll ask each of the panelists in turn in the order that we spoke before. Not just if you had a summary definition for it, but answer the question for me: is it primarily a reactive concept, or is Europe, which is who we've largely been talking about, reacting, or is it a progressive, organic initiative outgrowth that's has a positive agenda, not just a reactive agenda? I hope that's it's a pretty broad question, but they'll get harder as we go along. Matt, do you have a view on that?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think it invites quite a philosophical answer, actually, this question, which I hope is okay at this time in the morning. I attended an event yesterday with the Commissioner and asked a very similar question, actually, in the context of the EU Data Act, but maybe I'll sort of combine some of the response I received there with my own thoughts. I think when it comes to sovereignty, there are different layers to it. So first of all is the individual, and the notion that the individual is sovereign, which I think in the context of digital policy means ultimately you have control, particularly over the data that stems from your use of digital products and services. And to an extent, you're able to decide with whom that data is shared. And we have a regulatory framework in Europe under the GDPR, which puts in place a sort of a framework of both consent and then the kind of lawful basis from which third parties would need to be able to access the individual data. So to an extent, that is, I'm not going to say it's completely achieved in Europe, but there is at least a framework that delivers on that notion of kind of the individual. I think what we're seeing increasingly in the policy discussions is then abstracting that to, firstly a member state level, and then obviously with the EU, you have this kind of regional bloc, which is both an economic and a political bloc. And there it's about asserting the control, and I think the phrase that I used before is the ability to be masters of one's own destiny at the national and then with the EU, the supranational level, which really comes down to reducing dependencies. And we see this in all sorts of different areas of technology. So, the other one, which is very prominent at the moment, is around the manufacturing of semiconductors. And we have the EU Chips Act, which is about reducing dependencies. What's really interesting is on the back of that announcement, Intel has stepped forward and announced a major investment and partnership with the EU, with the Commission, in order to deliver on the objectives of the Chips Act and to ensure more actual manufacturing can take place in Europe. So you reduce those kind of extended supply chains and dependencies. But of course, Intel is not a European globally headquartered company, but it demonstrates there is a version of sovereignty which allows for that collaboration within a framework which is set out by EU policymakers. And we think that's a really interesting example that you could extrapolate then to other types of digital technologies, in particular cloud, data processing and edge services. So that's maybe something that I would kind of then put back to the panel. Do we agree that there is a kind of a version of sovereignty which is absolutely which is compatible with the the partnership and collaboration of kind of global companies? And then maybe just your last point on is this a proactive or a reactive? Particularly if you take the approach as we did with our report, which is very much using cloud and edge solutions as a case study, like you said, I think there is a reactive element to that agenda, recognizing that if you look particularly at sort of existing centralized cloud solutions and services, the market, is by and large, dominated by service providers out, that are headquartered outside of Europe, and the opportunity to compete for those more centralized, particularly infrastructure services, may have passed. But there is now an opportunity when it comes to edge services in particular for European service providers to step forward and to lead and take advantage of what we have a very strong, kind of industrial and manufacturing base in Europe. So that's where the proactive agenda comes in, I think. So yeah, few responses there.
That's great. A lot of food for thought there. Elena, do you have a thought on my my questions?
Yes, and I would fundamentally agree with all that Matt has said. I do think that in terms of a definition, the title of our panel is very fitting because we're in the search of digital sovereignty, and I think we're in the search of defining what digital sovereignty means. If you take it from a theoretical or philosophical perspective to a technical or political perspective, that definition and the conception around digital sovereignty varies widely. And not to repeat Matt's great overview of that, but I do think we go from looking at Europe's strengths and finding ways to increase the strengths of the European Union and its industry, reducing its weaknesses, including dependencies, and not necessarily focused on the exclusion of others or a protection approach to, especially at the political level, some definition or some positioning of digital sovereignty in a more protectionist veil where it is more clearly defined as just not being dependent of non-EU, whether it's technology, energy, or other. On the defensive and reactive versus proactive, Matt, I thank you for raising also the CHIPS Act, because I too believe that the agenda really for now is twofold. We do definitely see a reactive approach when it comes to those efforts that could be considered a bit more protectionist around digital sovereignty. When you think, as I was explaining in the cybersecurity certification space, about some of those requirements that it would essentially limit the ability of non-EU organizations and companies to provide certain services and for European customers to rely on those technologies and innovations. But it definitely also is very proactive with the European Union's investment in critical infrastructure, investments and their approach with the supply chain, like the EU CHIPS Act, as well as, there are areas where there is a continuous building of transparent cooperation and synergies around with non-EU governments and industry, and with last week's announcement of with Biden's visit of the Privacy Shield framework being an example of that as well.
Great, thank you very much. I wish we had some, maybe in the audience we have some people from the Commission and we can draw them into the debate. Bernardo, do you have any thoughts on either the definition and whether the concept is reactive or proactive?
Yes, in the sense that I believe that actually we are growing and becoming more adult. So if you wish, we are gaining more maturity in our development in this debate. Now, if digital sovereignty is about being more independent, there are many ways to reach this independence. So the variety that we see is not really a concern for me. I'm quite comfortable with that. It's quite normal that to reach this independence, we can have our own chipset manufacturers. We can adopt a law at national level, which is protecting our 5G networks, which we did in Belgium something like 3 weeks ago. And at the same time, we are developing collaboration with other member states like the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg and the Netherlands, just to make sure we are streamlining our procedures to identify all the critical infrastructures. So I think, you know, it's a question of maturity. We are not naive anymore, and we adapt to a developing environment.
Thank you for that. It's very interesting. We've listed a lot of let's say legislative and regulatory initiatives coming from Brussels, everything from CHIPS Act, the Data Act, to cyber resiliency, NIS2. And also I think we alluded to the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and that was, in my experience, the moment where really the EU and the Commission saw that they could really set an agenda and change the way that companies and organizations do their business. And we use this expression in the US that the horse has the bit in his teeth. And I see that now in each of the raft of legislative initiatives that I think that there's an idealism to set, again, a positive agenda. And to my point, when it is based on empowering innovation, providing more to the EU citizen and the user, basing it on the needs of European economies and stakeholders, that's great. When it's based on we need to protect, again, we need to have national, regional champions like the United States has, like big wealthy platform companies, or we need to have what we see in our part of the woods is troubling signs of, at the infrastructure layer, language and narrative that's about securing part of the network, securing services, root services in the domain name system, having alternative domain name resolver services. That to me is, again, illustrative of sort of the creative tension between the two. So that brings me to a couple of other questions. If the EU is really setting the global agenda, and again, I wish we had some of the actual legislators and people writing. I feel like we have businesses and regulators on this panel really understanding the need for balance and wanting to work together to implement laws and regulations that strike that balance of openness and autonomy. But if the EU is setting let's say a global agenda, what is your advice to policymakers, I would say, not just in the EU, but around the world? I mean, certainly, Vodafone, Microsoft, you're in multiple markets. Are you seeing this in other regions? And if we had, as I said, someone in charge of drafting future regulation sitting with us, what would you tell them? And then my more controversial question will be about, do we see digital sovereignty taken to its extreme? And here I know that, as you travel to Moscow or if you travel to Beijing, there's also very strong concepts of sovereignty, control, the digital environment. And I don't know if you have a comment on that, if it affects your business at all. But so, what's your advice to policymakers generally in Brussels or Latin America or wherever around the world you may, Africa, where I know Vodafone is very prominent? And then secondly, what is the risk of taking it to the extreme if you see any? And let's go in the same order again. Matt, I always pick on you first, but hopefully I rambled on long enough for you to start thinking of an answer.
Sure, yeah, and I can be brief as well, so we can bring the other speakers in. I think maybe on the global aspect of the question that you asked, I could link to two markets where we're also present and we are looking at data policy. So one would be South Africa, and the other would be India. And in both, the governments have been putting out national frameworks to govern sort of the use of data, both personal and non-personal. And in South Africa, there was a cloud policy framework that was produced last year, which floated some requirements which, from our perspective, were really akin to data localization and would not have allowed for sufficient sharing of data across the region in a way which we really need to do if we're going to offer advanced analytic style solutions that go just beyond sort of the core connectivity part of our business. Because, as I say, we're in a number of different markets in sub-Saharan Africa. So we put some input to the consultation, and we're advocating for firstly a regional policy approach to cloud and data in Africa, but then ultimately sort of pan-African. And there are various different kind of organizations that can help facilitate that. Obviously, the African Union is one. So that's that's the perspective there. Of course, as I say, we're also present in India, and there's been a long-running discussion around both data protection and then also regulation of non-personal data, and some of the concepts that we've seen sort of developed in the European policy discussion are being sort of imported, as it were, when it comes to this notion of having sort of sovereignty over data and ensuring that the data that stems not only from Indian citizens but also from Indian businesses is retained locally, and the value that kind of accrues to that data is also retained locally. And then our feedback there again has been to underline the importance of ensuring that businesses are able to transfer data across borders, backed up with robust protections. And that's where the point that we often hear is that the protection should travel with the data wherever it resides. To your final question, sort of about other regions that take a much more extreme approach when it comes to sovereignty, in the internet domain, like China and Russia, of course, now with complete prohibition of access to service providers and information from outside of those regions. Of course, this is not good news for anybody. In our perspective, it's not good news for service providers. It's not good news for the citizens of those countries when it comes to accessing information. I think maybe to put one back to you, Chris, what was really interesting was the response from ICANN to the appeal from the Ukrainian digital minister, which was to essentially say you need to cut Russia off from the decentralized architecture of the internet, as part of a sanctions package. And the response from ICANN was, we absolutely understand where the request comes from, but we're really concerned, A, the precedent this creates in terms of other countries kind of just leapfrogging the internet governance process that you have, and secondly, access to information for people within Russia, because of course they would really bear the brunt of that type of action by being increasingly cut off from information flows in a way which is not going to help anybody. So I thought that that response itself from ICANN was actually really, really interesting. And I don't know if you're able to elaborate at all on the decisions that were taken there.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. This is the challenge taken to an extreme scenario. We'll come back to it because again, thank you for raising it. Elena, do you have a comment on the last question?
Yes, thank you, Chris. And I love the emphasis on the global impact, because I do think that we are, we really need to highlight and always bear in mind that Europe is setting the global standards. You start, obviously with the GDPR as we saw it, and as Matt was mentioning on the data protection, but well beyond, and not just the European Union, but maybe for from Bernardo's point of view and a national regulator, oftentimes we're seeing standards and policies starting at the national level that then influence the EU level, that then influence the global the global environment. As global corporations, we have to take something like the GDPR and take these standards and apply them globally, and so there is a real influence and positive influence that Europe can have at a worldwide level, and not just from a U.S. corporation, speaking from a U.S. corporation, but thinking about it conversely as a European entity, as a European corporation, competing and leading and succeeding outside of the EU borders, being able to work in a framework of global standards and legislation and regulations that actually are feasible and allow them to compete. So because of the relevance and importance of the global impact, it is even more important that when we think about regulation and we think about pursuing sovereignty and digital sovereignty, that we bear that in mind so that we remain balanced. I would say it is obviously absolutely legitimate that Europe wishes to establish rules that aim to protect its EU data and citizens, and that to protect its fundamental values and the culture. And it's also an absolute, I believe, commitment and obligation for anyone operating in the EU market, like our company, to do so in respect of European values and European laws. So we need to strive for that, and we need to work together, as everyone, I think, on the panel here has agreed vehemently, that there needs to be a lot of multi-stakeholder cooperation so that we reach a balanced and proportionate solution to these global issues. On bringing the digital sovereignty to the extreme, considering where we're in right now with this horrific war on Ukraine and the exacerbating of the sovereignty space from both territorial and a digital perspective, I think we need to really look at the value of strengthening and continuing the strategic collaboration with like-minded countries and regions, so that we can continue to protect and persevere in the fundamental values and the rule of law. So if you think about the transatlantic collaboration and the opportunity through the Trade and Technology Council that we have in really driving collaboration on these key issues across the Atlantic, and that will be key for our economic and security resilience.
Thank you for that. And again, kudos to Microsoft for actually always looking at this big picture and really stepping into the role of sometimes global diplomacy to balance some of these conflicting value systems and approaches to technology regulation. So Bernardo, you heard from two companies that are very committed to helping strike a balance between regional sovereignty in Europe and interoperability, compatibility globally, and also how they're coping with some of the more extreme interpretations of sovereignty. Do you have any views or advice for policymakers?
Yes, thank you. Actually, my message for policymakers, but for ourselves as well, actually, is always the same. What needs to be supervised, what needs to be controlled, should be controllable. Just because if we are serious about ensuring that these many EU acts are effectively implemented, in my view, the regulator should not be too far. It should be kept in the loop. Because otherwise we will again be naive, and actually it will be only a window dressing exercise, if you wish. For example, in my view, there is no point to leave the big platforms evaluating themselves alone what is a systemic risk, as it was the case in the Digital Services Act. Because, of course, let's say that out of experience, I'm not really supporting this idea of code of conducts and the way we will, all the actors of the market alone will take care of fundamental values, if you wish. So otherwise, if it is not the case, as I said, we will fall in a situation where actually this framework will not be effective at all, and it will lead to some problems with the level playing field.
Yeah, spoken like a true regulator, because you get to enforce compliance with these rules and regulations. And you make a very good point. I think it's a risk in Brussels if there's overreach and it's not enforceable, as you say, control what can be controlled, then you lose some of that credibility if you see that you're aiming too high. So we will urge anyone to keep you in the loop as these regulations and laws are conceived. And again, I hear you in terms of, as I always say, striking that balance. It's not enough to leave it to self-regulation or codes and conduct, but at the other hand, you cannot over-promise the ability to control what the different actors in the space do. I'm delighted that we have a few minutes left, but also more delighted that we have a couple of questions that we can address. And I'll let anybody on the panel jump, raise a hand, shout if you're interested in addressing the issue. This question I asked about taken to the extremes lends itself very well to the question from Eric Lambert. It's as follows. Isn't a search for digital sovereignty colluding with all of the current requests for sanctions due to commercial or armed confrontations and increasing the risk for so-called splinter nets dividing into large blocks? So again, I guess it's dangerous to talk about sovereignty in a time when we feel like the world is actually possibly breaking up into competing blocks. Does anyone have a comment on Eric's question? Do I have to call in somebody?
Well, just from my perspective, is I would be really interested to hear in the context of that. I don't know if we got round to the the ICANN response to the request from the Ukrainian government, because that is absolutely
okay.
the thing that's an issue, and you alluded to in your opening remarks that we are living in a time which it feels less kind of conducive to globalized solutions and much more to kind of a more protectionist policy, essentially, because the world is less kind of, I don't know, safe, free, open, however you want to describe it, as it was perhaps 10 or 15 years ago.
Well, I'll gladly put on a panelist hat to address the question. For people in the audience who hadn't been following closely, in the opening days of the conflict of Russia's invasion, the Vice Prime Minister, who is also the ICT Minister of Ukraine, approached ICANN, the organization, asking specifically if parts of the internet infrastructure, namely the country code top-level domain registry, .ru, if you will, and others, and encryption certificates that we manage could be, quote unquote, withdrawn or turned off. And the response that came, and there's a challenge when you're a global organization with a technologically neutral mandate to not seem heartless and unsympathetic, because we absolutely do sympathize with the terrible experiences of the Ukrainian people. The response, however, that came from our CEO explained really, on the one hand, it's not technically possible or easy, and in fact, we really dissuade people from trying to think about how to make that technologically possible or easy. Secondly, even if it were technologically possible, would it have the desired effect of the requesters? And the answer to that really is no. It may have had, deleterious effects, but to their aims. But thirdly, one commentator called it institutional suicide. I would call it governance model suicide, because ICANN acts only based on consensus of global stakeholders and these kind of decisions. And so there's really no precedent and no space for what is essentially the secretariat of this body to unilaterally make an operational decision, because our mandate is to keep the open, interoperable, expanding, technologically neutral internet going. Now, those pressures are not going away. The board of ICANN at the same time put aside a $1 million fund available to people affected by the conflict in terms of their connectivity and ability to access digital services in the internet. And so it's not solely aimed at Ukraine, but in this instance, it's primarily being addressed to Ukrainians as a way to, again, indicate our desire to help people stay connected and have access to digital services. But this is digital, digital splinternet at its extreme. I think the pressures will remain, and it'll be a challenge for people like me who are doing engagement with different stakeholders to, again, the value of the expanding internet upon which everything we've discussed today is built really needs to be upheld in a way that separates it from even really trying tragic geopolitical trends. So that's my answer to Eric's question. Eric also raises, there's a lot of sort of self-sanctioning and governments taking their own decisions. Some, hardware providers, internet backbone providers, others, unilaterally, it's their own business decision, have made some decisions that do impact people's ability to access the internet in those parts of the world. And again, it's a voluntary network of networks. So we just want everyone to keep using the same addressing system so it remains one internet. And again, explaining the technological impacts, whether it's a legislation in Brussels like the NIS2, or it's something as extreme as what the Ukrainians requested. I think we'll be able to finish on Mike Nelson's question and then possibly wrap it up with a 1 minute, if anyone has a 1 minute closing comment. Mike Nelson says, I am so glad to hear the focus on edge solutions. I like to talk about the cloud of things, where each of us have hundreds of devices using different globally available services, helping to live better, safer lives, wherever we might be. Unfortunately, that vision conflicts with the conflicting cybersecurity, copyright, geo-blocking, surveillance rules, and how to force legislators to choose in this conflict, global services that enable and enhance everybody's lives, or local control. I think that's largely what we've been discussing today. But does anyone have any thought on Mike Nelson's question? Please,
I would agree,
Elena.
Chris. Yes, this is the dilemma that we're living today. I am optimistic. I don't think that there isn't a solution because this conflict is not solvable. Yes, I do think that innovation will be more and more at the edge, will be more and more about enabling everyone, industries and companies and individuals and citizens and communities to actually, as I was mentioning at the outset, to create more, not just consume more, but to create at the edge. And so that will require the ability to provide technology and computing ubiquitously, right, across. Is that currently in conflict, or does it face restraints because we have local laws and national systems? Yes, but we've always had to deal with that, and society has always had to deal with national borders, and now obviously the challenges are greater than ever within the digital space. But I do think we should, not the answer, but the approach should really be that multi-stakeholder approach of listening to the regulators' needs, listening to the governments and the citizens and the civil societies. I think the earlier panel was, rightly so, mentioning how the end user and the user needs to be put at the center. We should really focus on what the end user really needs and what we want to do, and to help drive innovation, to help drive competitiveness, and then all work together through it, not just from one perspective or the other perspective. So
that's a very well made point. Any other reaction to Mike Nelson's question? I will say, I agree with Mike. I agree with Elena with the what will empower all of us from an economic, creativity, I say individual self-determined point of view, is to give people the ability to connect globally. And as Vint Cerf said once in a meeting, if you believe there is a value in everyone and every device being able to connect with everyone else and every other device, then you can only support an open, global, interoperable, expanding internet for our digital services. I think the fact is most around the world, people, users, and even companies still tend to think locally and think within their own local market. But for those that break out and realize that they have the ability to tap billions of people around the world, whether they see them as customers or allies in a civil society movement, that this is a value worth protecting. And again, I think the answer to Mike's question is what I'm hearing from our panelists is the key word is balance. If you want citizens to feel protected and empowered, and you really, as a, the sovereignty initiatives tend to come from the government stakeholders who have a role in helping citizens be safe, but also enabling their prosperity and success. I think that there's a way to give that, demonstrate that responsibility if, say, you're a governmental stakeholder or government to your citizens, while not cutting off opportunities that the global connectivity, interoperability enables. And I think that was something that I heard actually from all three of the panelists. We're down to the last 3 minutes. Mike Nelson has put in an antitrust article about Vestager saying that she sees no antitrust concerns on the cloud yet. That might need to be a topic for another panel. But since we have 3 minutes left, does anyone have a closing thought or a word of advice, or what you'd like the next panel on, say, digital sovereignty to focus on? And again, I'm putting you on the spot, so it's not required, but if anybody would like to take a crack at that.
Well, just very briefly from our perspective, Chris, to repeat the recommendation, the appeal that we have in our report, which is to regulate rather than exclude, and to leverage all the tools that, in particular, the Commission has in its arsenal, which is, it's quite a considerable, hefty toolbox these days to deliver on the outcomes, that we've been talking about, better, more cost-effective solutions for EU citizens ultimately. So yeah, that's the kind of the closing remark from my side. Please, let's regulate rather than exclude.
Great. Elena, last thoughts?
Yes, I would second that, Matt, and I would say from a cybersecurity perspective, when it comes to securing our infrastructure, supply chain, and our digital work and personal lives, frankly, we've long known that security is a team sport, right? No single product, technology, entity, or country can go it alone in protection. And so, Chris, as you rightly mentioned, the decentralized nature of ICANN and our internet system and the benefits of that, or the need for that, and the culture of information sharing and collaboration in what we consider the defender community today is the backbone of what we've achieved from a cybersecurity perspective. And so, again, it's a call for today for all ISPs, cloud providers, device manufacturers, industry rivals in these markets. We all recognize the need to work together on security issues and be able to do so across borders. And so, as we continue the drive and the legitimate search for a digital sovereignty solution for Europe and for the European Union member states, we bear in mind the importance of being able to collaborate across from a security perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. The last minute goes to Bernardo.
I'm the lucky one. So I think that we are very much convergent. In a nutshell, from my side, I would say, as I previously said, don't be naive. Make sure you have alternative options to preserve your independence. The regulators are the one who will make the regulation happen. So keep them in the loop and keep cooperating. That's it.
Thank you. Well, and thank you to the panelists for all the work you're doing in this space. I'm hoping, even with all this discussion of sovereignty, we can return to a paradigm of globalization and integration that I grew up in. But if we seek a balance, I know it's going to be thanks to the efforts of you and your organizations. Appreciate the conversation. And I will turn it back to Lynn and say thank you very much.